and welcome to the fourth round recap of the over the board tournament that I played this last weekend. The game that I'm about to show you will, first of all, it'll bore you to death, but we'll skip quite quickly through that part. Secondly, you'll be amazed and astounded by the GM level brilliance, I like to think, and that happens in the game. And then after that, just when you're emotionally invested in like how great it is after such an epic battle and matching of wits, and your heart will be shattered into a million tiny little pieces. If you're only interested in the chess, you can jump to this timestamp over here, but if you want to hear how we got to the stage in the tournament, you can hang around for a little bit. If you missed the first couple of rounds and you don't want any spoilers, you can check the playlist in the description and just watch those videos before you come back and see what happened in the fourth round. But assuming you've seen the round 3 recap, you know that I'm coming out of a game that was really unpleasant to play because I blundered a pawn on move 5 and was lost for the entire game. So I was quite tired. I played 3 rounds so far that day. I'd been up since 6 o'clock in the morning. I did have a little bit of a break before the fourth round started in that my game wasn't the last game to finish. I asked to get a little bit of extra time so I could go check into my accommodation. So I did that. So it was mostly driving in the break, but still checked in. So that put my mind at ease. I had a little bit of food because I hadn't really eaten properly yet on the day. And then I got back and I was paired against someone who had half a point. Now remember, I have 2 points so far. So it's someone who's lower rated than me. It's someone who I wasn't really familiar with. I don't think I've played against him before in the past. So I wasn't sure how the game would go. Obviously, I'm not expecting an easy win, but I'm also not expecting to have the toughest match of the tournament. I had the black pieces for this matchup and my opponent started with c4, which is not all that usual. I don't really see that many people playing the English over the board. So I just went on with c6, hoping that it would transpose to some of my d4 theory. And it ended up doing that, although I'm not entirely familiar with this. A lot of people just don't exchange on d5 on move 3 or 4 if they start off with d4, then c4 and takes. But I just thought, you know what, it should be okay. Let's just follow our standard plan. So knight to f3, developing our pieces. Another fianchetto. I think, if I'm not mistaken, this is now 4 games in a row where everyone has fianchettoed the bishops against me. And then I went knight to c6, just developing my pieces once again. Here was a little bit of a moment where I wasn't entirely sure what I should be doing, because often in these openings, if you move the bishop out, so let's say you go bishop g4 or bishop to f5, queen to b3 ends up being a little bit annoying because it's attacking your b pawn. It's also putting some pressure on your d5 pawn. So I wasn't entirely sure if I wanted to move the bishop out and also if it was going to be able to like go anywhere. But then e6 is also just, it's not a nice move to play because you are busy blocking your bishop in. It's quite hard often to get an e5 push in, although I think that's sometimes meant to be your plan. And your bishop often doesn't really have a life on this side of the board, unless you can maybe get it to a6 and do something along this diagonal. But not entirely sure, so I decided to just play e6. I thought probably in future I'll be able to get an e5 in, or I've played a lot of these positions with my bishop just stuck. It is a French bishop, essentially, and it usually manages to come into the game later, unless I'm playing against a really high-rated opponent who's able to just squeeze me to death. So e6, I decided to play that. My opponent fianchettoed the bishop. I just went bishop e7. I thought that bishop e7 was a little bit better than bishop d6 or bishop b4, but I think all of this is just a matter of preference. Bishop e7, the advantage is then if something like bishop g5, you don't have to drop the bishop back if you're worried about the pin. So just bishop e7, not doing anything too spectacular, just doing simple development. We both castled, my opponent went rook e1. I decided to go a6, so I was thinking maybe I can do something over here, maybe play b5, put my bishop here, rook on the c8. This is kind of what I do in Blitz as well, just a very standard simple plan that's not necessarily addressing the needs of the position, but it's you don't have to think too much about it. Which is maybe bad because I was playing classical chess and I should have been thinking, but you also don't always want to try out new ideas over the board because they can end up backfiring spectacularly. So my opponent went a3. I was like, okay, no prizes for guessing what they're about to do, but I went b5 anyway, and they went not b4, they went bishop to g5, so now I was like, well, I already have my bishop on e7, so that's all fine. And I decided to just carry on with my plans. So bishop b7, hoping at some stage in future I'm going to go e5, try and get rid of this pawn, and then try push the d pawn and try and maybe do something on this diagonal. So rook to c1, so what my opponent played, I continued with rook to c8, and my opponent went b4. And you can see, even though it's not like entirely symmetrical, it's quite a boring game so far in terms of like, I don't have any interesting pawn pushes. I can't do e5 now. It's really difficult to try to do that. I can't really get an attack on the king because everything's super safe with the Fear and Shadowed Bishop, the knights over there. If anything, my opponent maybe has some play with e4. They might be able to get that in. But I can't play a5 because then I drop this pawn. Our bishops are super, like, there's just not a lot happening in this position. So I wasn't really enjoying this game, but I was having faith that hopefully my opponent would make a mistake at some stage. And if not, I would try and come up with some sort of plan there that I could try and play for a bit of an advantage. So h6, I'm trying to play more patient chess as well and just not always try to go for a knockout blow when it doesn't exist in the position, trying to play things a little bit slower and give my opponent a chance to mess up rather than being the one who messes up while trying to make something happen. So I thought h6 though was a decent move because escape's great for the king if it needs it in future, so no back rank mate. And then also asking the bishop the question, do you want to exchange yourself off for a knight? Or if you go back to h4, I can maybe play g5 if I'm not scared of my king getting like ripped open, but winning some material. And if it goes back, then it's like, well, my knight can move. It can already move, but I don't have to worry about trading off the bishops or anything like that. So my opponent decided to take over there, so I was happy with this. So potentially hitting the d4 square in future, because I do have now 2 attackers on it. They have 2 defenders as well, but there might be a situation where like e4 is played, and then if I take, I now have my queen busy attacking this as well, and it might be forgotten about. Unfortunately, though, my opponent went e3, so just keeping everything solid over there. And I was now, what on earth am I supposed to do in this game? So as I said earlier, I can't really find any good pawn pushes. Something like a5, I struggle with the b5 pawn, and I'm not sure how I feel about like queen to b6 to defend it, and then trying to do this, after which they still don't even need to take. And they might be able to, let's say I take and they take over here, they might be able to take advantage of the a file more than I can. So I wasn't entirely happy with like queen b6 and trying to go for this. My bishop is doing absolutely nothing, and it has no hopes of doing anything else. So I can't really do anything there. My rook's already on the c file. My bishop is like also not doing much. This rook, I can move it across, but I was like, at some stage I need to do something. I know I said I was trying to be patient, but I also didn't want to just like go into autopilot, make dumb moves. I wanted to at least have like a semblance of a plan with what I was doing. So I was like, if I go over here, I'm not really helping the push because remember I said if the pawn moves out the way, if they move e4, I get a bit of pressure on this pawn. In a similar manner, if I go e5 over here, they manage to get some pressure on the d5 pawn. So I wasn't really keen about this, and I was like, well, the point of rook e8 would be to try and push this, but I don't see that happening. And I just wasn't finding any way to make my plans work. So I thought, let's be strategic. We have a lot of time. There's not a lot happening in this position for white or for black. So it's not as though I need to desperately defend and try and make sure that my opponent doesn't get extra moves. So I was like, we have time. Let me go Grandmaster rerouting of the knight. This is not the Grandmaster play that I mentioned. That's still coming up in the game. So I decided to go knight to e7 with the idea that I can hop my knight over here. I'm also just opening up the c file as like maybe even rook c4 at some stage in future. It doesn't really work now though, because knight back to d2 and then my rook has to move. Potentially, unless I'm happy giving up the exchange. But I thought knight to e7, I can hop over here, I can hop back, and look at this beautiful c4 square for my knight, where I'm now attacking this pawn. I'm defending this if I want to do a push there in future. It's just a very nice looking knight. So I was quite proud of this plan. And I'm like, I don't know what my opponent's going to do. And then they went knight d2, and I was like, oh wait, thank goodness they reroute their knight. So while I'm trying to go here, here, and here, they are just going to try go, and they're a little bit faster, hop into that square. And once again, just such a frustrating game, because I felt like everything was so like equal and nothing was happening, and none of us were like trying really to make anything happen. But anyway, so knight went back to d2, I went to f5, I just carried on with my rerouting in any case, because I realized as well that if the knight gets here to c5, sure it's attacking the bishop, which initially worried me a little bit, but then I thought, I am so happy over here if they give up their beautiful active knight, which, I mean, imagine that knight on c5. You don't even have to imagine it, let's just move on 2 moves and see it in action. So this knight on c5 is a very pretty looking knight, we like that knight. The bishop on b7, in contrast, is not a very happy piece. I mean, it can't go along this diagonal. I can't open up this diagonal at any stage in the future. Like, even if I push an e5, they don't have to take it. And if I take it, they could take back, and my bishop is still just blocked in. My bishop's doing nothing over here. Can go back to a8, which is an even more active square. Or it could go back to c8. which so it can't even go there because the rook's there, and even if it did go there, then I have to still do e5, weakening d5. Yeah, it's not a great bishop. So if they give up their knight for my bishop, I am so happy. Really, really happy, and then I can just like jump over here or go rook over here, and life is great. So their knight is pretty happy. I realized I just need to make sure this is defended. Currently it's defended by the knight, but I need to make sure that it is defended. I'm not just giving it away for free, and if they do happen to take it, I'm super happy with that. So I went rook to c7. I tried to figure out like how should I defend this bishop, because I ideally would still like to hop my knight to c4, because it is a nice square for my knight, and it's also like blocking up this file for their rook a little bit as well. So I want to move the knight, but the knight's defending the bishop, so I thought, can I defend it with the queen? I didn't really like putting my queen on the c file. I also didn't really see where it was going. Queen to e7, I was like, it's taking more squares away from my pieces. So I thought rook to c7, because possibly in future I can go queen to c8 if there's some play along the c file. But if they take over here, now I can take back with the rook if I've moved my knight away. So they went queen to b3, which is now defending this square as well, connecting the rook. So I presume that's the reason for that move. So I decided to go across to c8. I wasn't entirely sure if I would be able to do an exchange sacrifice. I didn't think I got enough compensation for it, because when they have a pawn over here, my bishop's not great. I'm not guaranteed to get my bishop active, and they then just have a very nice strong pawn that they can support along the c file if they just move this knight out of the way. And they started to double as well, so now I decided, let me just make sure there's nothing happening on the c file, so let me put my knight here so that even if they double up, it doesn't matter that I've got my rook and queen on the same file. There are no weird tactics with like moving the knight out the way and then maybe going for something like this. Yeah, let me see if I can get an example. So let's say I just move a pawn, random pawn push, and they move this out the way, and I do another random pawn push, and they go here. There might be some weird tactics like this. Knight takes b7, possibly even knight takes e6, if they have enough defenders on the rook and are also threatening like either a check or a major piece or something. So it wasn't entirely sure with, or happy with any of that. Decided to go knight to c4 to block things up, and my opponent went rook to d1. So I was like, I gotta try and do something. Patience, even though I'm trying to be patient, it's hard to put that into practice in actual games. So I thought, okay, one thing that I could potentially do is if I go bishop to g5 and my opponent has miraculously fallen asleep at the board and doesn't really know what's happening here, I might be able to go bishop takes e3, pawn takes e3, and knight takes. I'm forking the rooks, and you might be like, but Rebecca, you've given up a knight and a bishop for a rook and a pawn. There's another pawn though, so it's a rook and two pawns, and I felt like, especially in a position like this, if I can get two pawns, if I can get rid of one of the rooks, it's not too bad. And my minor pieces, my bishop isn't the greatest at the moment either. So knight to b1 was then played. Rook went across to d8. I think here is just at a loss for what to do. So I can't take here anymore because the queen's defending. That's the reason that I went back. I can't really do anything here. I couldn't see that a pawn push would work at all. Yeah, just had no idea what to do. And all of my pieces, so my bishop was defending this, going back or going here didn't seem to do much. I can't really get a pawn push to work. So I just thought, you know what, rook towards the central file can't be a bad thing. We'll do this and see what my opponent plays. So my opponent went back to d2. I then went back to e7, thinking maybe at some stage I'm going to take this knight if it gets a little bit too annoying. I was also looking at my opponent's possibilities of playing a4, and I wasn't entirely happy with that. So I thought at least then I can go like this, and then the knight's gone. It's not defending the square if that's a problem. It's not attacking a6, so possibly I could do something like a bishop to c6, and then this is well defended. Even if I take here, queen takes, it doesn't matter. So queen went across, which once again isn't doing too much. I decided to take the knight. I thought this was the time to do it, and they took back with the b pawn. I think here I was expecting them to. No, okay, I don't think I was expecting them to take over here. The difference is if you take back over here, I now have the potential to activate my bishops with a push like that. I wouldn't do it immediately, but I can potentially set it up. I can go like e5 and then go for d4. And with the rook on this file, it's just looking a lot better for me. And I can also try and undermine the pawn by going a5 and then getting this pawn here. So they took with the b pawn, which makes more sense because now I can potentially go a5, but it's maybe weakening the b5 pawn and I can't do an immediate push. And also their knight is still threatening to take mine, so I don't want to overextend my pawns and end up, when I take back, I just lose the pawn. So here I decided to, once again, try and make something happen so that I could be happy. And I pushed the pawn to e5, thinking if they take, I can potentially push I can potentially push my pawn in future and trade off my bishop, just try and get my bishop active, because currently I'm playing essentially a piece down. And yeah, another thing with this is I was just thinking maybe I can get like my queen out, do something on this side of the board, but for now, e5. We got to make something happen. It looks as though it's temporarily giving up a pawn, but I get this one. So notice that I am busy picking it up, and I can also then probably get this pawn in future. My opponent, of course, then didn't take. They instead went knight to f3. And here I had to make the decision, do I want to take over here, or do I want to push? Do I want to go something like f6? And after some thought, I decided it was, I know it's been like a really horrible position and really frustrating. I was also quite tired as well, so I wasn't super invested in this game. It was super frustrating for me. It wasn't a position that I enjoyed playing. I was tired. My stomach was also making like all sorts of strange noises, and it was the time that they turned off the aircons, so it was like deathly quiet except for my stomach singing the song of its people. But yeah, so all in all, I was just like super frustrated at this point, but I thought, you know what? If I take over here, I'm potentially helping them out, because they could take back with the knight or the rook perhaps, and even if I win this pawn, they have a lot of play along the center of the board, or they could also do this, and then they can like quite easily swing their rooks across and just create some counterplay along the e-file. Whereas my pieces, I mean, I still have my really, really sad bishop, which is possibly even going to have to babysit defend this pawn on d5. My pieces are all like on the right-hand side of the board, and it's a little bit trickier to swing across. I don't have as many like defended squares over here. So I thought, let me not take, and rather just push and keep the position a little bit closed. White's pieces now are doing absolutely nothing, so they're all locked out, and it's not easy to see how they can get into the game. And I was thinking my bishop, which has been such a problem so far, could potentially in future, could go bishop to c6 or across here, or I could move my queen out and then go bishop to c8 and like try and get it somewhere into the game. So that was my thought over here. And I also thought the like more locked up I have the position, the less chance there is that I will end up blundering. So knight to d2 happened, and I now continued with my plan. So I thought queen to g4. First of all, I'm attacking the rook. I'm secondly vacating the square if I want to put my bishop there. And then also it's just like an aggressive looking move with the rook. I was thinking at this stage as well, there's a concept that I've seen in a couple of Grandmaster games where it's, or even, I don't know if they were Grandmaster games, but just like high level games, where it's the whole concept of if everything's locked up on one side and the opponent has all of their pieces busy defending on one side of the board, sometimes if you can, just switch the attack across to the other side of the board, and maybe they aren't able to get their pieces back in time to defend or to deal with your threats. So this was also partially what queen to g4 and a couple of the upcoming moves are about. I was thinking, well, everything's tied up on the queen side, let's just swing across to the king side, see if we can do anything there. My king's pretty safe with the center locked up as well. It's really hard for them to do anything. And maybe I can even go like rook c6 across here, get my bishop to c8, push pawns. There might be something here. But another thing is, yeah, I'm just attacking the rook. So they dealt with that, rook to e1, and now I decided to go h5. Which is maybe not the best move, but it had some sense. So I was thinking, I can try to go to h4. I could possibly even push to h3. I might just take though and then start swinging my rooks across. And that's what I decided to do. My opponent then decided to trade, and I took back with this pawn. I was thinking if I take over here, once again, it's giving my opponent some counterplay, so they can maybe swing their rooks across. Okay, their queen would not go there because that would be blundered, but they can swing their rooks across, try play along the b file, try infiltrate my position, and that's not great for me. So my a6 pawn might be quite weak. So I didn't like that, whereas if I take over here, this pawn does look a little bit sad now because it's all on its own, but it can be backed up with an f5 in future. It's also being defended by the bishop. And yeah, now I have these pawns which are all defending each other. They're also this one now, I mean, let's say we traded off all of the pieces. So just the kings, the rooks and the queen and the bishops. If these were all just gone and it was my move, I mean, I have a passed pawn. Kind of like these pawns have switched position. So I'm very happy with this. And yeah, their pawns, in contrast, though, if they try to push forward, my bishop is covering that. So my bishop is looking a little bit better, even though it's not great. They then went queen to a5. So they're attacking this rook, and fortunately I did notice this, and I noticed as well that I couldn't do anything crazy like moving my rook across because this one's then also attacked. So I went queen to d7. I thought this was best, it was defending both rooks, trying to reduce any form of counterplay so that I couldn't forget at some stage in future and need to move one of my rooks and then not be able to do it because it was pinned to the other rook. So queen to d7 is just defending everything, moving the queen back, and it's risk-free play. They then went rook to a1, and I decided I have time, let me just try and keep everything together. So f5 just to solidify this pawn in case I needed to move my bishop at some stage in future. And I was feeling okay over here. I was feeling like, if anything, I was maybe the player playing for an advantage, but I knew that it was still an uphill battle and it wasn't easy, and it wasn't very easy to see a plan and how to proceed and sort this out. After this, I realized I wanted to try and keep everything locked up over here, or try and at least preserve my pawns. And after this and this, I was like, then there's the open file, then this pawn is going to have to be babysat. Not entirely happy. So I thought rook to a8, and I honestly thought over here that this was just going to like win a rook. I'm not entirely sure why I thought that. I don't know if I saw that the queen could go back or could go back over here. As I say, I was quite tired and hungry and preoccupied with the fact that my stomach was rumbling. So yeah, not entirely sure why I didn't see that was a possibility, but I thought, well, now you can't really take. Or maybe I just thought that then the queen has to move away and then it's not attacking this over here, and we're fine with that. I don't know. But in any case, I went queen to b4, and they went queen to b4 instead of taking over here after I went rook to a8. And now I decided to go over here, thinking if they take, I could potentially take back with the bishop, in which case I'm defending this. Or I could also take back with the pawn, but then the pawn's at least defended by the bishop, so that's set up. I'm also getting my bishop out the way so I can swing across to this side. I'd maybe like to go rook to b7 so that I can go something like a5 and then push. I think this was more of my plan. So let's say white just does a random move over here. I was thinking here, this is defended, and they can't take here because it's defended by the bishop. Whereas in this position over here, if I tried to do this, they can just take over here, and I mean, I should get a pawn back potentially, but this is not looking very great at all. So that was the idea behind bishop to c6. And my opponent then went a5, and I was like, wait, now everything's proper locked up. Because I did think, I was being a little bit optimistic, thinking that I might be able to get a little bit of play on the queen side as well. Maybe like get my pawns rolling, looking at my a5, b4 ideas. Because then my pawns are just really, really strong. And then if you imagine a situation where I'm able to play this, let's go to this line, not this line over here. Like if I could get a rook on the b file and start pushing pawns, like maybe this leads to something, and then also my bishop might become a little bit more active if these pawns start moving. So that was my hope, and after a5 I was a little bit sad, so I thought let's just switch focus again and go across to the king side. So h4, thinking it is, you might be thinking, but it's just a free pawn. The thing is, notice that I will definitely get this pawn back. There's no way to defend it. So let's say I go over here. You don't have any pieces that can defend your pawn on h4. So I can just go here, and now I have a beautiful open h-file. I can probably swing a rook across, maybe like king f7, rook to h8, and then go after this, maybe target f2, maybe even play along the g-file. So obviously my opponent didn't want to take over there, and they instead decided to go to d2. And I realize now that they can also switch across the other side of the board, looking potentially at something like queen e2 and then coming across here. So I decided to go queen to f7, just covering the square. So I thought if the queen goes across here, at least there's no way that they can go queen to h5 and then maybe even like take here, swing their rook across by moving their king out of the way, and maybe get some counterplay on their own. This just makes sure that all of these squares busy leading to that, well, along the diagonal, if the queen does go to e2, all of those are covered. So they did go queen e2, sure enough. And here I played bishop to d5. Here I was just thinking, I don't want them... Sorry, the dogs are barking as well. Here I don't want them to be able to play d5, maybe give up a pawn or two in order to open things up. Although their bishop is currently very much out of action. I was also thinking here, I don't want them to be able to sacrifice. I don't think there's any safe sacrifice over here, but just making sure that there are no chances. And I was also thinking, if I defend this pawn, then what that means is I might be able to push this pawn, and yeah, if I can get these two pawns rolling, they are two passed pawns, even though this one there's like an enemy pawn behind my pawn. It's still a passed pawn, I think. I'm not entirely sure on the exact definition. But in my mind, it's a passed pawn. So if I can get these rolling, things will be great. They went rook over here. And happy me, I was like, how do you stop my pawn? So I go rook to b7, preparing this. Then they move the rook in front of my pawn. I was like, oh yes, that's a thing that you can do. So that was wonderful. So I thought, let me just go g6. It's not usually advised that you push your pawns in front of your king, but here my king's really safe. There's no like real way for the queen to infiltrate. Remember I also Remember I also said that I wanted to put the queen on f7 so that I was covering h5. But now I wanted to maybe swing my queen across to the other side of the board in order to attack this pawn. So I thought if I move to g6, now I'm covering this square and they just can't deal with that. I was also thinking that if they take over here, I'm free to like move my queen around, attack the pawn without worrying that their queen gets to h5. So that's why I played g6. And I was also thinking as a further thing, potentially king to g7 and then swinging the rook across. That might have been another possible way to get my rook into the game. So they went rook to c3. Just blocking this pawn as well. I realized at this stage my opponent wasn't really... Yeah, I'm just going to deal with the dogs. Okay, we're back. The dogs will probably still be barking, but we'll see how it goes. So I realized over here that my opponent wasn't really playing super actively. My opponent was basically just going back and forth, busy making sure that I wasn't making progress, but more kind of playing reactionary chess, stopping my threats, rather than creating their own threats and playing aggressively. So I decided, let me just carry on. Let's go king g7 and then potentially swing the rooks across. And here my opponent made a bit of a mistake, so they pushed their pawn to f3. And the reason that this is a mistake, well, first of all, I think maybe they got like frustrated with the position as well, tried to reduce a bit of counterplay or make something happen. I'm not entirely sure because f3 is a bit of a strange looking move, but I suppose it makes sense because if I take, you can take over here. Now if we trade, like, maybe you're going to get into the game. Now your pawns are looking a lot better. So potentially that was the idea. It's always important to remember though that your opponent doesn't have to take. And even if you take back over here, that gives me an open file for for my queen and rooks potentially. But yeah, so not entirely sure. F3 was definitely not a move I was expecting, but it was a move that I was very happy when I did see it. And I decided to just go for the simple winner pawn. So h takes g3, they took back, and now I go queen to c7, I'm hitting this pawn, and more importantly, I'm hitting this pawn. I think this is a more dangerous pawn to lose, and I was very happy when my opponent played f4. So I was like, okay, on the one hand, I'm now being blocked out of counterplay on this side, but I get a free pawn over here, and also with everything locked up, I don't have to worry about any counterattack being launched on my king. So I took the free pawn over here, they swung across with their queen, I then went back to c7. Okay, I lost my position and also the dogs started barking, so I hope this is where we left off after rook to a3. And I went queen to c6. I think what I was worried about, although it doesn't really make sense now, I think I was worried about like rook taking over here and then I couldn't take back with the pawn because then I dropped this rook. But in retrospect, I just take over here and they wouldn't take here. So I'm not entirely sure what I was thinking over here, but I went queen to c6. I do remember though being worried about things happening over here and me losing one of the pawns because of a potential pin. So they went back to a1, and now this is maybe even, it was still a concern to me, although it doesn't make sense at all. So I decided to play on the other side of the board just to see what could happen over there, now that I think I calculated here that there were no possibilities with taking or taking this over here. So I went to g5 with the pawn, thinking if they take, I can probably go queen c7, and then attack this pawn over here. I could also just go across here and then get to the h-file quite easily, pick up the pawn, then this is weak. It's just not looking great for them if they take. So they went king to f2. I was like, oh wait, they can move their king. And here I thought that I'd been playing pretty well and cleverly. I was like switching across to the different sides of the board, not just playing on one side, being patient as well, like not trying to push all of my pawns and making something happen there. So I was quite dejected when they went king f2 because I was like, well, now my plans don't work. Nothing works here. But I carried on trying. So I thought, let me go to g4, with the idea being that, once again, it's locking things up. It would have been better to take over here, but this looks really scary, to me at least. I just think after this, I'm like, open lines to my king, we are not happy. But the engine suggests this is a line, with the idea that if I move my king out of the way now, it's a lot easier for me to just swing pieces across, whereas they have like their king and their bishop in the way and their rooks are like, they have to go back in order to try and attack my king. So my king should be very safe, but theirs is not quite as safe. So that makes a bit more sense for me. I thought, let me just lock it up. This bishop is completely out of the game. the tables have turned somewhat, because previously I had the bishop, which really sucked. Now my bishop is still not great, but it's slightly better, I think, than my opponent's bishop. And I was also thinking, if I can trade things off in the endgame, I definitely have a superior endgame, because my pawns, as I mentioned earlier, they can still be pushed. My opponent's pawns, if they are pushed, they're going onto light squares, which just doesn't work. Whereas my very well protected pawns, I know your pawns are supposed to be on the opposite color to your opponent's bishop, and I think your own bishop as well, but over here my pawns, I think, are busy like locking their bishop out, so I think it's quite good for me. They went rook to a5, so once again I was like, okay, I still can't push, but I went king to g6. I'm like, I have a plan on the other side of the board. They went king to e2, going across, so I thought, okay, this is the moment where I can swing a rook across. I can't use this rook yet, because a rook takes a6 is a huge problem. I mean, I blundered my queen then, so it's important to use the other rook, and there are also no problems over here, so it's not like, if actually, did I look at this? If I go here and rook takes, okay, so I can take, oh wait, yes, I did look at this. I was very worried about the pins, as I mentioned, but I saw that, it took me a while to notice this, a couple of moves at least, but I saw that my queen was going to be defended by the bishop. That is the important thing that I'm missing here as well. So that isn't a possibility. So with that out of the way, I could move the rook away from defending it. So I could play rook to h7. Whereas previously I was keeping the rook here so that it was busy defending this pawn, because I knew that after rook takes, I can't take back with the queen, because then rook takes over here, and I don't like this at all. So they went king f2 after I went rook to h7, just bringing their king a bit closer. And I went back to f7. I was thinking, like, maybe I swing my queen across to h6. Maybe I double rooks. At the moment, I can't really do too much, though, because this is being attacked, and I need to watch out for this pin. So queen to a3 happened. Oh, something I noticed as well. Okay, it'll come up a little bit later. So king to f7. They moved their queen up. I went rook to h2. Their rook went back to b1. So I was like, oh no, now they can defend as well. This is getting worse and worse. I then went across to h6. And they went to g1 to defend, and I realized there was nothing there, so I went back with my queen. They went back with their rook, and I was like, okay, they're just shuffling, so I have time at least to go back and try and figure out what's going on, try and see if there is some sort of way to get an advantage and to break through, because it's been a super boring game, it's been super frustrating, it's not the most fun game as well, and I don't want to get a draw, because I'm doing decently in the tournament so far. I'm still probably going to get a bye tomorrow. This was, remember, on the Saturday, and every single person in the tournament except for one person is going to get a bye. I'll talk more about that in rounds 5 and 6 because it's a bit more relevant there, but I thought I was going to get a bye, so I need to make sure that I at least, like, I play it out. I play my best to try and squeeze something from the position. So I went queen to b7. Just the reason for that was that if I did drop the a6 pawn at some stage, I wasn't going to be attacked by the rook. After they took, my queen would be out of the way. And they went queen over here. I was like, still not too much happening. And now I swung across because I had a hint of an idea over here, I think. Okay, I gave a bit of a spoiler of the great plans to come, so I have edited that out, hopefully, by the time you see this, and I've remembered why I played queen across to e7. The reason I moved across to e7 was just so I could go bishop b7 to defend this pawn, so this rook was free to swing across. And then another thing that I was looking at as well is it's just stopping this pawn even more from moving forward because it's pinning it to the queen. So the queen went back then to a3. As you can see, my opponent really isn't doing too much. They're just shuffling around. So bishop to b7, I'm now defending the pawn. And the great thing is I can move my rook out of the way as well, and the only way they can take is if they give up the exchange. So bishop back, they went rook across, and I think this is where I managed to see quite a nice little plan. I went rook to h8 with the idea that I saw the pattern that if I might be able to sacrifice this rook on g3, so something like this. I was even potentially prepared to sacrifice the exchange for the bishop, but at the moment it's pinned. But I was thinking I can go rook to h3, and then I take over here, and I swing the queen across, and it is checkmate. So they went queen to b4, still just shuffling back. They did not see rook h3, so I was really, really happy with this, because this is my grandmaster plan. This was the one that I was quite proud that I found this idea, and I was really happy when my opponent didn't spot it. So queen went back here. I then took. I don't think they saw this at all. I think they just moved their queen back for general defense. I took over here. Obviously, so if they take, it is checkmate because my pawn's covering this, my queen's going to be covering those squares. So they didn't do that. They went rook across, and here I thought for quite a bit. We didn't have the most time, but I thought, okay, let me go queen h4 anyway. They went rook a2, but I was like, no matter what you do, it's not looking great for you. They might be like discovered check things. They might be rook takes over here. A rook a2. I decided that this was the best course of action. So rook to f3 check, with the idea that after the bishop takes, I can now win their rook after trading queens first, because we don't want to blunder our queen. And that is exactly what happened. So they took over here. If they don't take, they're in even more trouble, I think, because after this move, what was I going to do? Oh, I think I can. Yeah, I can just go queen to h3 with the idea that I'm putting some extra pressure on this. You can't go over here. You can't take the rook. I mean, this is looking great for me. I might even have just gone queen over here because I didn't have the most time left in my clock. I think by this stage I was down to less than 10 minutes. And if they take back, I can go across here, maybe exchange. I mean, if the king goes back to defend, maybe here, sacrificing the exchange. I have so many nice advanced pawns that I think I should be fine. But after bishop takes f3, I took the queen. They took very important intermediate move so that you don't blunder the queen, as I said. The rook then swung across to a2. Well, I had to take the free rook over there, and they saved their bishop. So over here, my opponent has 20 minutes left on their clock. I'm down to 4 minutes. So it's a little bit stressful in terms of time. I'm quite relieved. I'm like, my plan worked out. It's gone from a really, really boring game to an idea that I was really, really proud of. And yeah, really happy. And I'm like, 4 minutes is more than enough time to convert. I'm 2 pawns up. My pawn's are also great in terms of I have this pawn, which is a passed pawn. It should be able to do something. I have these 3 pawns. My bishop is busy stopping their 2 passed pawns. I'm like, this is amazing. So I thought for quite a little bit of time over here. I was like, how do I continue this? And I decided, I was like, okay, first of all, their king is cut off. They can't really do anything over there. They can move their bishop, sure. I was like, if I'm able to advance my pawn, I'm going to be able to pin their bishop or just chase their bishop away. If I manage to get my pawn to c2, their bishop has to move and then I promote. Like, you can't stop that. And I was like, and king d2, so it's a here, push, and then, sorry, here they can't go to d2 yet, but let's say they go like h1. I was like, I can probably just push. And then after king goes here, go like bishop to d5, and then swing across to like defend the, I don't know, there should be something, or I can even just win the free bishop. That also works. Give up the pawn for the bishop, and then I still have an extra pawn. I still have a good bishop. I maybe have to watch out for tactics and stuff along here. But so I was like, okay, great. So I went pawn to c3, and my opponent then fairly quickly went bishop to b3. I was like, this is a very strange move. Because I was like, when I go check, if you move your, well, that's a little bit of a spoiler. But I was like, if I go check, you can't, like, if you block, I go c2 and you're busy losing your bishop. And if you don't block, if your king moves, like, I can probably trade rooks. And then I have these, like, beautiful pawns. And so I was like, I don't understand bishop b3. And then I looked at the other side of the board and I was like, oh, well, that's not great. So yeah, it took me a little bit of time to figure out what was going on here. I did just move into fork. The terrible thing is, I don't know where it was, but a while back when I'd moved my king, I think it might have even been like, okay, it was probably around, it was over here. It was over here, I moved my king. The reason I went king g6, I remember that now. The reason I went king g6 was I noticed that there was a discovered check along here. So I was like keeping in mind checks along diagonals, definitely, because at some stage I was like, oh, maybe I should move my bishop back and reroute it. And I was like, oh my goodness, that would blunder my queen. So let's say I went here and then it's just boom, game over, free queen, which is pretty sad. So I had these checks in mind, but I think I was just so, like, so intent on looking at, first of all, that side of the board, because that's where everything was happening, and like getting my pawns rolling. And also because my king had been so safe for the rest of the, the rest of the game. My king was super, super safe. And there was just no way to break through because my pawns are like an impenetrable wall. I just didn't even consider that this might be a possibility. I decided though that I still had quite a few extra pawns, so I might as well play on. I'm also like, I'm not wasting that much time. It's the last game of the day. The adrenaline has made me feel like slightly less tired. I'm still tired, but slightly less tired. I was like, I have nothing to lose by keeping on playing just a little bit of time and notating some more. So after they took, I think if I didn't have these pawns over here and this pawn over here, I probably would have resigned. But I thought, let's play on and see if there's any way that my opponent can slip up. But being down on the clock as well, unfortunately, makes it less likely that my opponent's going to slip up. So I went pawn to b4. They then pushed their pawn, decided let me just carry on rolling the pawns. They went over here. I moved my bishop out of the way and also moved it to potentially support something like this. They moved their bishop across because I was also thinking over here, I was like, maybe I can win these 2 pawns at some stage with my king because my king's really close. Maybe I can get them to give up their bishop for 1 or 2 of these pawns. And then I'm playing bishop and 3 pawns versus like a rook and 2 pawns. And like I can hold that potentially. So it's frustrating, but it's not the end of the world. They went rook to h1, so I just carried on pushing the pawn. Over here, I was like, oh my goodness, it is over. Because I noticed that my opponent could go here. And then if I go across, they can go here. This is what I calculated out and what I was sure was going to happen. I was like, well, now this is a problem. Because I had initially been planning this. And then I'm like, I think they can just take over here. They can just take, because if I take, the whole plan is rook to h8, I move across, you get a queen. Which is not very pleasant. And there's absolutely nothing I can do to defend against this. So I was like, maybe I can't go bishop back here. If I take over here, it's exactly the same thing. So rook h8, king moves, and this promotes. Fortunately for me, though, my opponent didn't see this. So they went rook h8, and I was like, this is the end. No, wait. Yeah, rook h8 is not the correct move order. You have to go c7 first. So they went rook h8, so I moved up. They checked me again. And I was like, well, definitely not going back to d8 where they can move forward with check. So I went to c8. Then they went bishop takes. And over here, I'd calculated all of this out. I'd had some time to calculate because my opponent was using a bit more of his time. And I had a glimmer of an idea that I was like, it probably won't work, but I might as well try it. They pushed over here, and initially I was like, oh yeah, free pawn. Then I realized it wasn't a free pawn because rook to c7 is a move. So king to d8, and they take. So it would be really, really, really great if their king was a little bit further away. Let's say their king was on h1. Then what I'd be able to do is, I think I'd be able to go king to d7. If they went across, then I push this pawn. They can't go across and stop it. They can take this, but it doesn't work. But there's the well-known, or well, hopefully well-known endgame that 2 pawns on the 6th end up beating a rook. But that is only if the king is further away. Unfortunately, their king is too close. So even if I manage to get this pawn forward, they should be able to stop it. But I thought I'm still going to try, and I can maybe try decoy the king in this direction and then run with this pawn. So I went king to d7. They went across. This I'd all calculated out. I pushed this pawn because I was like, now you have to go in this direction. And I'll admit, when I initially calculated this, I thought they would just go for a different variation. I thought they might like keep their rook here or something like that, but they obviously thought a couple more moves ahead. So after this, I was like, it looks as though they've blundered, but I was like, they probably have a plan. The g3, and unfortunately, after they took, I realized that they can just go to b7. So they can go to b7 and swing their rook across and then capture the pawn. But I was like, I want to just make 100% sure that they've seen all of this, so we're going to just play it out. So after g3, king takes, they went, now I pushed on g2 because what else am I supposed to do? They went check, and then I resigned the game because, yeah, their plan is very simple. I can take their pawn, swing across, I can't do anything here. They still have 2 pawns left, they have a rook, and this one, even though it's like fairly advanced, their king is just close enough. So it's quite unfortunate that that was the situation. There was no way to avoid it, unfortunately, and to try and go for the plan, like maybe switching up move orders. It still fails, unfortunately, because here they can just take here, and then if I push here, they're close enough, and if I push here, they can just move their rook across to defend it, or even their king across, because they still have the whole b7 check. But it was a nice little tactic, so I was glad to at least like be able to calculate that out as a potential defensive possibility, even though it didn't work. And yeah, overall, with the game, so I said at the beginning that it would be a super boring game, and then like grandmaster level stuff, and then heartbreaking. I was not upset with the loss. I wasn't happy to have lost, but I wasn't devastated because I don't think I made like really stupid moves for the entire game. It was boring, and maybe I could have like done a couple of things differently in that part of the game to try and make things happen. I definitely need to work on my middle game play and try and improve on that. But I was super proud of the fact that I'd had the ideas of like switching from side to side of the board. I was really happy with the whole rook to h3 and then sacrificing for the pawn, and just being prepared to go for things like that as well, because previously, potentially even when playing against a low rated player, I might have just gone for a draw, just like offered them a draw and said like, it is what it is, let's just move on with our lives. It hasn't been an exciting game, let me just accept that I'm getting nowhere. So I was happy to have at least tried something a bit different, even if and it worked out amazingly well. And in terms of the just missing the fork in one move, it's once again, it's like going back to over the board chess. You're going to miss things like this because you're not used to playing over the board. I did have a lot less time than my opponent, so even though it's frustrating to make mistakes like that, I'm not like I wasn't super disappointed or super upset that I had made a mistake like that. It was more just like, ah, it's really annoying that I didn't win this game. But overall, I'm happy with the way that I played. It was one mistake, and I still tried to put up a defense at the end. So that was round 4. That was the end of the first day of the tournament. It was a crazy day, and after starting out really strong, 2 out of 2, I had a super tilting game where I didn't even really play a game, and then a game that I should have got the point for, but unfortunately didn't. So 2 out of 2 to 2 out of 4. It wasn't great, but fortunately I had the rest of the evening off, so I could get some food and have a little bit of an early night and be back bright-eyed and bushy-tailed for round 5. And presumably that was going to be my last round of the tournament. If I didn't get a buy in round 5, I would have got the buy in round 6, I was presuming. So yeah, stay tuned to see what happens next. I will put the link to the round 5 video when it's been released, and otherwise I will put the playlist over here as well, so you can go check out the rest of the games if you missed any of them. But thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in round 5.